So we are 6 days removed from the Michigan Georgia game. Georgia won that game 34-11, and really a topic that Mark wanted to cover was that game indicative of both of those teams? So was that, Georgia, let's just call it what it was, a dominant win over Michigan? Was that indicative of who those two teams really are and were this football season? Dre, I'll kick it to you first.
Um, I'm going to go. It's half right to say that. That's indicative of both those teams. I think it was an indicative of a Georgia team. I'm not saying Georgia played their best football, but I think that was a lot more indicative of the Georgia team we saw all year, besides the SEC championship. On the opposite side, I thought that Michigan played uh, uh, did uncharacteristically based on how they have the whole season. And I'm not saying that the result would have been different. Let me be very clear. I'm not saying that result would have been different. I still believe, all in all, even with Michigan playing the best and Georgia playing the same game, Georgia still wins. But I thought with the self-inflicted mistakes, like dropping passes, losing your guy in coverage, false starts, fumbles, interceptions, all the self-inflicted mistakes that Michigan had, the turnovers, the lack of being in the right fits with the rush defense, and you're not able to get home with your pass rush, which has been your strength all season. Um, yeah, I thought Michigan hurt themselves a lot, and I thought that played a huge part in why the game got out of hand so quickly. So I will say that statement is half right.
And the reason I ask that is because we're coming up on a rematch, and a lot of people just automatically jump to, well, Alabama beat them a month ago. The two teams played. They're the better team. They killed them. They're gonna beat them again. And that would seem to make, if you didn't watch sports and didn't live around sports, that would seem to make sense. All
Mhm.
the same guys are going to be on the field, same coaching staffs, same situation. Why would it not be the exact same thing? But we should know better from sports. And I'm actually going to probably post a video, if I really want to dive into it this deep, to go through rematches throughout history and try to track and try to come up with some kind of trend line for how that's played out, because we know we see it all the time in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Teams play twice in their division, obviously, and then meet several times in the playoffs. That's common. Playing conference championship games, and we see all sorts of results go all over the place. Um, Dre, I know you're a baseball fan, but toss baseball out of it. The pitcher is so paramount in any series that those two teams are pretty much a different team every night. But take the NBA. It amazes me that they could be playing, if they play a 2-3-2 series, that they could be playing in the same venue 2 nights in a row, same players, same coach, same everything. And it's not even that, in comparison to football, strategic of a sport, that much should change, you would think. And the Lakers can win one night by 18, and the next night the Cavs win by 12. They could be completely different games back-to-back nights with all the same personnel on the floor.
Yeah, I think what makes uh there's a bigger that what can impact both sports differently, that you can see that difference. I can't talk like I want to, but anyway, it's momentum shifts. In the NBA and basketball, you have runs. Teams have a lot of runs, right? And sometimes on one game, one team may have a longer run than the other team, and then that's why it's a close game. Or it could be a team like the Warriors who are hitting threes all over the place, and all of a sudden you're down 15, and the last game was a close game, right? So I think, in football, it's just tougher to have those kind of runs. You don't really see teams going on 21-0 runs in football very often when it's a really good matchup. If it's Alabama playing Mercer University, yeah, you may see Alabama go on a 28-0 run, right? But in football, you really don't see that. So that's why I think it it's rare that you do see like those huge differences game to game. And then also one thing that's going to be huge is that both teams have are just solely focused on each other, and this is it. And I think it's tougher to beat. I would love to see what you do when you do your deep dive, Mark, but it's tougher to beat a team back to back like that in a season.
Yeah, you mentioned how rare it is in football to go on a run. And with that, I think about the Georgia Alabama game where I think Alabama scored 24 points in the second half. And I think I think the final score was a 17-point spread. So you remove a, uncommon run like that, and you've got a much closer football game. Now, it kind of is what it is, right? The game is what happened, but nonetheless, I'd imagine it's had to be extremely difficult to play another team to play the same team within even just the same season. I mean, we look at Notre Dame and Clemson last year, and granted, there were more factors into that game than just playing each other. But I would imagine in college, especially in college football, I'd imagine that it doesn't go. I doubt there's unless there's a huge gap. I doubt that it's usually a sweep for one team or the other.
But also, I'm sorry I was about to say something there, Mark. But like, also, I think the situation is different too because going into the SEC title game, you had a desperate Bama team that needed to win, right? And a Georgia team that, quite frankly, I'm not saying they went in there and laid down, but quite frankly, didn't need to win the game. That was a gotta have it game for Alabama, in which I actually think it's more reverse this time. Look, both teams want to win a national title game, but I believe it's Georgia based on how their season is gone and how they were embarrassed versus Bama. That I think has more on the line. They're like, we're not. We got our second chance, and we're not going to lose this game. I think it's different. I could definitely say it's different for Bama. Bama's not in a gotta have it game, if that makes sense, right? I just think the emotions going into this game will be different, and therefore you probably will see a different result. Maybe not in terms of the win or loss, but definitely how the game plays out.
So to spin this in the Michigan direction, the reason I brought that up was obviously we had the game that we had. It was not competitive. Right. But the way I evaluate teams, I want to know as close to whatever the truth is as possible to measure all those things. But this is all we've got. But then we can always make connections to say, well, these other things have happened for these two teams throughout the season. So therefore, when Rutgers shows up, if they were showing up to play Michigan or to play Georgia and we got a certain result, it would be like, okay, it was 52-10. Okay, that's what everybody expected. And then all these other results that the two teams play add up to make sense out of that result. This one, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe the SEC at the top is that much better than the Big Ten champion. That is certainly a number of factors would point to that being just what it is, that the Big Ten's a really good conference, but it's more like there's 5 really good teams, but the 2 best teams in the country by far are over in the SEC, and that's all there is to it, and that's the end of the explanation. And some talent ratings in recruiting would point to that to a certain extent, but not totally, not to that extent when Georgia's beating Kentucky and Auburn and those teams that you would not think are as good as Michigan. And I think it's reasonable, even for the most ardent SEC fan, not to be able to win that argument because obviously we saw the Michigan-Ohio State game. And even with Ohio State not necessarily being the best team that it's been this year, it's one of the 4 best teams and probably the 3 most talented teams in the country. So Michigan was able to do that and repeat that effort against other good teams. So I was on Michigan podcast yesterday. So I never know what Steve Dace is going to toss me. So I thought I better rewatch the first half because I wanted to really go through every play and watch every play and think, okay, was that a play that was won by Georgia because they out-schemed Michigan? They fooled them? or they were just better. That athlete was better than that athlete. And I think I came to that conclusion most of the time about the athleticism, but there were certainly things that Michigan did that didn't make a whole lot of sense, or Georgia out-schemed them a few times, I thought. But those Michigan players are going to be playing in the NFL. Georgia's going to have a larger amount of players, most likely, on this roster, on this team, that play in the NFL. But it's not going to be a huge disparity.
No. Well, and that is
How many big people though? And Des, I'd love for you to hit on that.
How many big people? Like linemen? Are you talking about, or are we talking personalities?
How many linemen? I think that's where it really is different. You have to really get into it. How many? I think what makes the biggest discrepancy and difference in terms of guys who are NFL talent and how it's currently translating the college game and based on the results is line play and skill positions on the outside, right? Like you can really see the difference, right? If Michigan's, as for example, they're good at sitting. No, bad example. Iowa's good at sending tight ends to the NFL, right? Tight end right? But that's like in the Michigan Iowa game in the Big Ten championship. That's the only position out of those two teams. Maybe outside of corner, because Iowa does a good job at corner too recently, that Iowa's going to send probably better talent, NFL-ready talent to NFL compared to Michigan. And Michigan, what I'm trying to say? So, and Michigan still wins that position overall guys going to NFL, but you'll have those George Kittles. It's a better player than any guy that Michigan has sent to NFL in the last 10 years, right? But overall, Michigan is sending more guys there. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you bring up Iowa and Kentucky played in a bowl game. And while a lot of bowl games could be discarded as exhibitions, I watched the game. Those players were fighting. They were playing hard. That was a real bowl game. Kentucky's the third best team in the SEC, the fourth best team they're in that 3 to 5 range. Iowa's in the 3 to 5 range. This is an even matchup between the conferences, and they played down to the wire. Tennessee and Purdue, again, they are like seeded teams in both conferences. 7th best team in each conference, something in that range. They played a freaking great game. That might have been the best bowl game they played hard. Purdue had a ton of opt-outs. Their two best players, David Bell is a great wide receiver. Yep. He opted out. Their defensive end, he's an All-American.
George Karlaftis.
He opted out. They had their number 2 wide receiver opt out of that game, and their secondary was a mess with opt-outs and injuries, and they won the game despite the controversial finish. That aside, you came away from that thinking, who's the better team? I have no idea. They were within one play, so it didn't really matter from an evaluation standpoint. So those two results were they made sense. This is I get it that Georgia's that good, but I'm just thinking, wow, if they played 10 times, 100 times, I think, I made a prediction. My prediction made absolutely no sense. I even said it while I made it because I said, if I check off the boxes, I'm checking off Georgia in most of the boxes. And I think they win this game 65 to 70% of the time. But I just think it's going to be Michigan's night. And people don't quite get sometimes when I make a pick and say one team's better. But if they're going to win 70% of the time, that does mean that the other team could win 30% of the time. So this could be one of the 30% of the time because they only play once. So I'm taking my shot, and I picked Michigan to win. I was dead wrong.
So was I. And I don't know if how old our viewers are, but if you guys have seen the movie Little Giants, but that was
that was it.
One time. My cousin Randy, we raced down, the big hill in Cherry Hill.
Brother Randy.
But it was I picked Michigan as well. And I think what we ended up seeing was a little bit. I'm a big believer that it's never just one thing in a football game. And I think that what we ended up seeing was, number one, Kirby Smart, who is, I think defensively is second to none. As far as coaching goes, I'd put probably Nick Saban above him, so maybe second to one, but
Of course you do.
is just phenomenal as far as his game planning, and he did that under Nick Saban for years and years, running his defense. But having that amount of time to game plan for an opponent and doing it in a way that's just super effective, and then also you bring in, you know, the talent of the 5 stars and things like that, which I like I said, I don't think it's ever one thing. So I don't think the team that has the most 5 stars is always going to beat the team that has the least amount in the matchup. But I think that's what I think that's what it was. And a friend of mine, Corey, who watches the show, but he had mentioned he felt like Michigan, it looked like they were in a game that they hadn't been in before, like kind of not a deer in the headlights. He wasn't that extreme with it, but just we're new here, you know, in that aspect. And I think that is understandable, because I even, you know, did a quick live stream before the game just saying that this is new territory. You know, Michigan's played in really big games, and I think up until that point they had played in, if not the most watched game in the Michigan-Ohio State game of the season, it was like top 3. So it's not as if they haven't played in any bright light games, but these lights are brighter than any other. And not that it shell shocked them or anything, but I just think it comes down to, you know, being a little tight, you know, making mistakes, doing things that you typically wouldn't, or maybe the noise is more than you thought it would be. So you have a tougher time communicating, you know, with like Dre, you mentioned the corner who lost his man in coverage down the field. You know, when it's really loud, you don't hear the sideline screaming, ball, ball. You know, you don't hear those things. So, you know, it's just to wrap it up, I just think it's usually more than one thing, and I think those are probably the things that contributed to things looking the way that they did on 6 days ago.
Yeah, I think, you know, what I saw was a team that was shell shocked, but not necessarily by the moment, but by the opponent. You know, like I think Michigan has to play the team that physically imposing all season. And I thought by the time it's just the game got out of hand. So sometimes that happens, right? I think Mark's right. If you play that game 10 more times, no, I think there's a couple of times in those attempts Michigan may pull the game out. Definitely the game would be a lot more competitive in terms of the final score. But I think what happened was that team was a little shell shocked at how athletic Georgia was, because they were clearly a step ahead of anyone they ever played. I mean, Ohio State, even as fast as they are, physically, I thought that was their biggest weakness this year. The physicality really wasn't there for that team this year. So, you know, you really can't count Ohio State being a true test in terms of physicality. Neither were Michigan State and Penn State, right? You know, they were decent teams. So I thought this was the first time on the field that Michigan, these guys, our guys, when it gets the guys across from them, they're like, whoa, you know, our offensive linemen were used to mauling people, right? That didn't work with Jordan Davis and those guys at the middle, and the Kobe Dean shooting through the line of scrimmage and blowing up everything, right? That, you know, it's different. It's different. And I think our guys just weren't quite ready for that. The problem is, Desmond, in terms of Michigan going forward, is that you can you can get better at not being shell shocked by the moment because you've already been there. Now you have experience. But how do you really make up for lack of athleticism, right? You know, besides just recruiting better. I mean, that's where I hope the issue is more what you say it is compared to what I say it is. Because if it's more what I think what happened, I don't know if Michigan would ever be able to close that gap.
Yeah, I mean, when you're the least athletic, you have to be flawless, which is almost impossible to ask a football team to do, right? To say no one hold, no one false start, no one, you know, no one ever miss an assignment. It's impossible. It'll never happen. So that's the difficult part, when the athleticism on the other side is either at your level or better, and then also you're not playing at it, you're not executing at a high level. I think we've talked about it earlier in the season too, when Dre, you and I had our complaints about Michigan throwing the ball. was that this style of football leaves you very little margin of error. Now, the last 3 games, we can throw that out the window because they absolutely dominated the teams that they played and played really well. But I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the point still stands is that, think about it, if for let's say Alabama and Georgia, right? Alabama could not run the ball, and they got to a point where they just abandoned the run. They didn't even try to run the ball. They were just going to throw the ball nonstop and again and again, and it ended up working for them because I look at the pass game. It's easier to hit a big 60-yard pass play than it is hit a 60-yard run play. So really, if you're able to execute when you're throwing the ball, you just have a better shot of getting those big plays and hitting, and having a play like Georgia did against Alabama, where they just completely blow the coverage. 4 guys are playing zone and 1 guy's playing man, or vice versa, and you get Jameson Williams running down the field by himself. Like, that that can happen still in the run game, but when you're talking explosive plays, that's why Lincoln Riley and those Oklahoma teams scored a lot of points. Well, although they were very effective in running the ball, they threw it a lot. So, it makes it difficult when you're not executing at a high level and the guys on the other side are just as athletic as you are, maybe more. So it's difficult, but I don't think that game was indicative of who both of these teams are. I do think it was for Georgia. They look like a team that was the number 1 team in the country. And for Michigan, that was a game that we have not seen from Michigan all season. And Georgia did go out and win the game. And so I want to echo the same thing you said, Dre, of it's not that I'm not giving Georgia credit. I absolutely am. But I don't think that was Michigan's A game or even B game. There's just a lot of mistakes, things that we haven't seen all season. And to be fair, I think if they both play their A games, I think Georgia probably still wins. But I think it's much closer than, the score finished by 23 points. But I think that game, that was even closer than what it seemed.